At 18, I lost my grandma, the woman who had been the rock of my life. Tough, relentless, and fiercely independent, she had run her own upholstery business for 50 years, raising 3 children along the way. My mom, the middle child, always seemed to clash with her. When I was younger, I'd often witnessed their arguments, wondering what could possibly drive them to fight over the smallest things. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. My grandma resented my mother because of me. For context, my aunt once told me that my parents had never really wanted me. From the moment I was born, they held a quiet resentment. For the first 6 months of my life, I lived with my grandma. But when I began to grow, my grandma insisted my parents step up and take responsibility for me. And so they did, though it was clear from the start they never wanted to. As a child, I was often subjected to cruel labels, especially from my dad, words like bimbo or dumbo if I made the slightest mistake. Those words hurt, cutting deep. But despite this, I excelled academically. I was the most driven among my cousins. It wasn't out of any natural ability, but because I pushed myself hard, encouraged by a strange, twisted version of support from my parents. My dad, a strict man, didn't tolerate anything that could be considered remotely feminine. I wasn't allowed to wear makeup. Tight clothes? Absolutely not. I couldn't even wear simple yoga pants without facing his disapproval. He didn't want me to embrace anything that came with being a girl. But no matter what, I complied. Still, his controlling nature weighed heavily on me. I spent much of my youth avoiding any actions he might deem wrong, steering clear of drinking, drugs, and even wearing clothes he deemed inappropriate. I wasn't allowed to go out with friends, not even for a birthday. And heaven forbid I ever invite anyone over. I remember finding ways to stay at school longer, to be outside the house where I felt trapped. But then, everything shifted when my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even though I despised him for years, I didn't want him to die. My mom, on the other hand, felt differently. She left him, saying she didn't want to be stuck with a sick husband. I watched as she packed her bags, leaving my dad devastated. I sat beside him on the porch while he broke down. Even at 14, I understood his pain. I got him a beer, the only way I knew how to comfort him, and when he saw what I was trying to do, he broke down in tears. It was the first time I truly felt like I had connected with him. From that moment, something inside me changed. My dad, for reasons I still don't fully understand, softened. He wasn't the same man. The rude, cruel father I once knew seemed to disappear. For the first time, I can honestly say he was good to me. After the divorce, it wasn't long before my mom moved in with her high school sweetheart, Morty. She was quick to forget about me, barely acknowledging my presence. I could feel it, the way she had divorced me too, not just my dad. I remember the emptiness when I'd show up at her place, only to find her glued to her phone, talking to someone else. She'd make up excuses whenever it was time for me to leave. Meanwhile, my grandma never abandoned me. She kept calling me and my cousins once a month for sleepovers, and those nights with her became some of my most cherished memories. 5 months after the divorce, my mom remarried Morty. He bought her a house, eager to build a future together. But once again, my mom had her own plans. Every time I visited, I would find her laughing and chatting away with someone else, not even hiding it. Morty found out about the affair eventually, and they fought, but my mom somehow convinced him it was a mistake. They stayed together. My dad's health continued to deteriorate, and in his final days, I spent as much time with him as I could. I'd come home from school, dreading what I might find. One night, it happened. My dad passed away in his sleep after months of chemo failing him. I was devastated. It was my grandma and my dad's family who arrived first when I couldn't stop crying. But when my mom showed up, she was alone. No Morty in sight. That's when I learned she had been secretly talking to the other guy behind Morty's back. She had lost him too. At the funeral, my mom made it all about herself. She constantly complained about how my dad's death came at the worst time, as if it were the biggest inconvenience. Everyone around her was shocked, irritated, and disgusted by her selfishness. Then came the reading of my dad's will. To everyone's surprise, it was announced that all his assets were to be handed directly to me. And suddenly, my mother's interest in me seemed to flare up once again. My grandma, wise as ever, was having none of it. She knew my mom didn't want me, she wanted the money. So, my grandma and my aunt helped me sell all my dad's assets and set up a college trust fund in my name. But since I was still a minor, my mother's name had to be added to the trust, giving her some involvement. And so, it began, the next chapter in a long and tangled saga. My mom's marriage to Joe didn't last. They didn't have a prenup, so when they divorced, my mom walked away with a substantial settlement. Grandma had warned her not to touch my trust fund, reminding her that she had enough money of her own. At first, my mom agreed to the arrangement. But when we started living together again, it felt like I was sharing a space with a complete stranger. She had changed so much over the years, and not in any way that was good. All she seemed to care about was dressing up and going out every night. She would come home late, always with different men, and take them straight to her bedroom. Every morning, I'd wake up to find someone new in the house. It became routine, strange men in and out, always a new face. Then, when I turned 16, my mom introduced me to Joe, her third husband. Right from the start, I could tell he didn't like me. His behavior was harsh and unnecessarily cruel. He would criticize me for the smallest things, and when I would bring it up to my mom, she'd confront him. That only made things worse. Covert hostility simmered between us all. But when my brother, Brad, was born 10 months later, everything changed. My mom began to paint Joe in a different light, claiming he was a good person who just had trouble expressing himself. I was told not to resent him and to understand him better. But it was clear Joe had no problem showing love to Brad. Oddly, my mom would confide in me, telling me that she had nothing in common with Joe, that she had married him for the stability he would bring to our family. But behind closed doors, their marriage was anything but stable. They would fight viciously, especially after Brad was born. Joe was obsessed with keeping my mom's attention on him and their baby, constantly demanding she be near Brad. He would even say things to me like how he wished I had died with my dad, or that I should just live with Grandma because he wanted his son to have all the love and attention. Those words hit like a punch to the gut, and it was mentally exhausting to live under that roof where it was so clear I was unwanted. Whenever I would question my mom about why she stayed with Joe, why she allowed this abuse, she would skillfully change the subject, avoiding the confrontation. One night, my mom and Joe decided to leave me and Brad with Grandma while they went out with friends. It started as an occasional outing, but soon, it was happening nearly every weekend. They'd asked me to watch Brad, but that night, I was studying for an exam. Grandma loved when I spent time with her, and I felt at peace in her presence. She'd cook me delicious meals while I focused on my studies, and Brad would play with his toys on the living room floor. Grandma had made it clear that she wanted my parents back by 9 p.m. That night, though, they didn't show up by then, or even at 11 p.m. By now, I was worried. My exams were the next day, and Brad needed to go to bed on time. If I didn't put him to bed, Joe would have a fit. My grandma kept calling my mom, leaving angry messages for her. Finally, at 12 a.m., my mom and Joe arrived, barely able to stand. They were drunk, giggling like teenagers, and we could barely believe they'd driven home in that state. Joe staggered into the house to pick up Brad, and my mom asked me to gather my things so we could head home. But my grandma had had enough. She yelled at them, furious about their reckless behavior. She told Joe she couldn't let him take his son home like this, and that we needed to call an Uber instead. But Joe didn't care. He fought back, telling Grandma to mind her own business, claiming he was the father and knew what was best for his son. The shouting escalated, with insults flying between Joe and Grandma. My mom stood there, silent, too drunk to do anything. I felt the tension building in the air, so I begged them to stop, to think about Brad, who was terrified by the yelling. But my words were ignored. Then, Joe crossed a line. In a fit of rage, he slapped my grandma. The sound of his hand connecting with her cheek was deafening, and I screamed in horror. "Stop it! Just stop it!" I yelled, but Joe didn't even acknowledge me. Brad, traumatized, began to cry. Grandma, clutching her cheek, screamed for me to call the police. I was too shaken, too frantic to think straight, but I dialed 911 through my sobs. The operator stayed on the line with me, reassuring me until the police arrived. When Joe heard the sirens approaching, panic flashed across his face. He suddenly begged my grandma, desperately pleading with her not to press charges, saying it would ruin his life and my mom's life. But my grandma was resolute. Joe was arrested for assault and taken away in handcuffs, his pleas falling on deaf ears. He kept begging my mom to help him, but she, for the first time that night, reacted. She started crying and yelling at him, furious at what he had done. My grandma made it clear to my mom that if she didn't divorce Joe, she would contact CPS, and my mom would lose both of us. My mom, terrified, nodded in agreement. Later, I would find out that Joe and my mom had also used drugs that night, along with all the alcohol. The only reason my mom hadn't been arrested was because she had remained silent, unlike Joe, who had been out of control. That night, Brad and I stayed with Grandma. We felt safe, for the first time in a long while. I stayed at Grandma's house because I refused to be alone with my mom. I was crushed, my heart shattered by everything that had happened. The trauma was too much to bear. But the next day, when my mom finally came to her senses, she realized just how badly Joe had crossed the line. She filed for divorce, forbidding him from ever seeing us again. The rest of the family wasn't so forgiving. When they found out what Joe had done, they were furious with my mom, and rightfully so. There were too many questions. Why had it taken so long for her to take action? Why hadn't she seen the warning signs earlier? My aunt and uncle yelled at her, their voices sharp and angry, until she was crying. They were so enraged by her inaction that they vowed never to speak to her again. As for Joe, his charges were a result of being a first-time offender. The court sentenced him to probation, which meant he had to attend counseling and stay away from us. He could only see Brad if my mom allowed it, and only if she was there too. He begged for forgiveness, but my mom wasn't listening. She divorced him, leaving his manipulative ways behind. She got a generous settlement, and from then on, her life seemed to take a turn for the better. I didn't want to stay with my mom after everything with Joe, so I moved all my belongings to Grandma's. Brad stayed with her. My mom hated this arrangement. She depended on me to babysit him, but she couldn't say anything, not with Grandma always ready to call her out. That year, I celebrated my 18th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult, to begin a new chapter. But life, as it always does, had other plans. Just a week after my birthday, Grandma passed away suddenly from a heart attack. It was completely unexpected, especially since she had never had heart problems before. After her funeral, the family was informed of her will. She had divided her assets equally between my mom and my aunt, giving them both family heirlooms and expensive jewelry. For my uncle, she left him the car he had always loved. For my cousins, she set up college trust funds. But for me, she left something far more significant, her house. The house where so many happy memories were made, the place where I'd felt safe. It meant everything to me. I was in shock when I found out, and tears of joy streamed down my face. Grandma had left me the one thing I would never have to sell. Sadly, Brad wasn't mentioned at all. I don't know if it was an oversight or if it was because he was just my half-brother. Regardless, my mom was furious. She said giving me the house was worth far more than her jewelry, and she couldn't believe Grandma would leave me so much. No one else had any complaints. They all understood that Grandma had given us what she felt we deserved. But my mom wasn't satisfied. She raged about how Brad got nothing, bad-mouthing Grandma for being selfish. That's when I snapped. I told her she should be grateful Grandma even left her anything at all, especially after everything Joe had done to her. That set my mom off. She yelled at me, telling me I had no right to bring up the past, and it made my anger boil over. She then started telling me I should sell Grandma's house and move in with her. I told her that I loved living in the house and that I would never sell it. It meant more to me than money. She kept pushing, but I stood my ground. Living on my own has been a revelation. I'd spent my whole life surrounded by toxic people, but after moving to Grandma's place, I finally found peace. I had never lived alone before, but I've been learning to be with myself. I've also been going to therapy to deal with Grandma's sudden death. With everything happening in my life, I decided to take a gap year. I'm no longer a minor, and I want to remove my mom from my trust fund. To do that, I needed her signature, as well as to remove her as a beneficiary. 2 months ago, I went to talk to her about it. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin, who she'd been seeing for a few weeks. He seemed like a nice guy, but much younger than her. Unlike all her previous husbands, Robin was different, but I didn't bring up his age. I asked my mom if we could talk privately, and she agreed. I expected this conversation to go smoothly. After all, the trust fund was my father's money, and I was of age now. But when I told her I wanted to remove her from the trust, she freaked out. I found it strange. I reminded her that this had always been the plan. Now that I was an adult, I wanted to manage my own finances. She refused. She told me I was too young to make that decision, especially since I wasn't going to college this year. Her behavior made me suspicious. She kept insisting I could always come to her when I started college, but I wasn't buying it. Later, when I was driving home, a horrible thought crossed my mind. What if my mom had been using my trust fund money all along? It seemed far-fetched at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling. So, I decided to consult a lawyer to get clarity on the trust's terms and conditions. The lawyer reviewed the document and agreed that my mom needed to sign off for me to access the funds. I could check the account's balance, though, and that's when I found out the horrifying truth. Not only had my mom been withdrawing small amounts over the years, but after our conversation, she had completely wiped the account clean. The ground felt like it had been ripped from beneath me. The betrayal was crushing. I felt angry, devastated, and utterly helpless. I spent days crying and moping, the weight of it all too much to bear. I knew she had to be using the money. Why else would she have reacted the way she did? Confronting her wouldn't help. She'd just deny it or make up some excuse. I needed to teach her a lesson. And then, as fate would have it, my mom called. She was excited. She was getting married again, to Robin. She guessed about how he was the one and how they were planning a grand wedding to celebrate their love. I almost rolled my eyes. I'd heard this story before with every man she'd been with. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her what a horrible parent she was, how she'd stolen my money. But instead, I stayed silent. I kept my mouth shut. I wanted to savor this moment, to relish the feeling of what was to come. My mother was getting married, and that gave me the perfect opportunity to strike. It was time for revenge. I decided to call a family meeting. I needed my cousins and trusted relatives on my side for the plan I was about to execute. They had to know the truth, so I laid it all out. I showed them the documents proving how my mother had been stealing from my college trust fund, the money my father had left me. Not only had she been taking small amounts over the years, but she'd also wiped the entire account clean once she knew she would no longer have access to it. The shock and disbelief on their faces mirrored the pain I had felt when I first discovered the truth. I told them how everything seemed to align. The timing of her wedding was suspicious. How could it not be when she'd likely drained my account to fund her lavish celebration? I wasn't going to let her get away with it. My plan was clear. I would humiliate her at this event, and I would make sure she was arrested for what she'd done. My aunt, uncle, and cousins stood with me. They promised to back me up. They agreed to help me expose the truth, no matter what. The wedding came last week. It was the event she had invited the entire family to, her grand church wedding with Robin and the extravagant reception that followed. I had prepared for this day. I wore a t-shirt that screamed the truth in bold, bright red letters, "My mother is a gold digger." I had it custom-made just for this occasion. When Robin and his family saw me, their faces registered shock, but I didn't let it faze me. I simply smiled, walked to my seat, and waited. The rest of the family knew what I was about to do. They were ready. And when my mother, blissfully unaware of my intentions, began walking down the aisle, I remained seated, making sure to keep my composure. She didn't even glance at me as she passed, so I knew my plan was working. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The priest asked if anyone objected to the union. This was it. I raised my hand. The priest looked surprised, but it was too late to stop me now. My aunt, uncle, and cousins all raised their hands too, joining me in this stand. My mother and Robin looked horrified. I rose from my seat. That's when my mother finally saw the words on my t-shirt. Her face turned crimson with embarrassment in front of all the guests. I exposed her. I told the whole room how she had stolen my money that my father had set aside for my education, and how she wiped out my trust fund completely. My words rang through the air, and I held up the documents as proof. Her face drained of color, and whispers began to circulate through the crowd. I wasn't done yet. I demanded to know why she would steal from her own daughter, especially when she had already been married 3 times and had received more than enough alimony from her previous husbands. The room filled with gasps as Robin, confused and clearly unaware of my mother's past, turned to her. He asked why I was talking about 3 marriages when she had only ever mentioned one. My mother glared at me, furious, and started yelling. She denied everything, claiming she had every right to my money because she had been married to my father. She even told me I should be grateful to her for giving birth to me in the first place. I fired back, telling her that what she had done was illegal and that I was going to make sure she got arrested for it. She scoffed at me, calling me ungrateful, insisting it wasn't a big deal since she had practically raised me. She argued that as my mother, she had every right to the money. But then Robin asked her a question that changed everything. He asked if this was how they could afford such an extravagant wedding if she had been using my trust fund for it. My mother went silent. That silence, that admission, was all anyone needed. And that's when the chaos erupted. The room exploded with anger. My relatives joined in, expressing their outrage at what my mother had done. She tried to defend herself, claiming it was a private matter between the two of us and that no one else had the right to judge her. But things escalated quickly. My aunt got too close while confronting her, and before anyone knew it, there was shoving. The shouting became unbearable, and someone called the police. When the officers arrived, my mother refused to calm down, continuing to shout and yell at everyone. She was arrested right there. I went to the station with my aunt to give my statement, and soon after, the charges were pressed. My mother was charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I could hardly believe it as I wrote this. I never thought I'd be in this situation, especially with my own mother. Since then, I've been receiving calls from everyone. Some relatives have expressed concern, while others are indignant, claiming I went too far by involving the family and getting my mother arrested. But on my side, my family believes I did the right thing. I can't help but wonder, though, did I go too far? Update: thank you to everyone for your kind words when I posted this. I was overthinking everything at first and felt so guilty. I never hated my mom, not until this. I never wanted to file a case against her, and even now, it feels like a bad dream. But I know that this is the consequence of her own actions. For those of you who are worried, please don't be. My uncle helped me find a great lawyer, and we're confident we will win this case. My goal is simple: I want my money back, or at least as much as I can recover. As for Brad, he's doing okay. He's still too young to understand what's going on, and he's currently staying with Joe and his family. Update 2, it's been 6 months since my last post. The court ruled in my favor. My mother has been ordered to pay back every single penny she stole. She begged, she cried, but the judge didn't budge. Now she has to liquidate all her assets and probably sell her house to make things right. It feels incredible to write this, especially after all the torment I've been through. The only thing that has kept me going through these tough months is the thought of my grandma and my dad. Grandma would have been proud that I stood up for myself. And my dad? He would have wanted me to have his money for my future. Update 3, it's been 3 months since my last update. How was everyone's new year? Mine was fantastic. My mother, facing the weight of her actions, has repaid the full amount she took from me. The legal proceedings forced her to make amends, at least financially. But for me, the hardest decision has been cutting ties with her completely. The rest of the family agrees. We all decided to distance ourselves from her, no matter how much she tries to reach out. She seems to think we'll just forgive and forget. But we won't. In the meantime, I've been spending my gap year reflecting, figuring myself out, and healing from the past. I've spent time with cousins and other family members, and it's been a big part of moving forward.